Welcome to TransAtlantic Productions, where we bring you in depth discussions on some of the most pressing issues affecting Africa and the world. Today, we have a very special guest, David Hundeyin, an award winning investigative journalist, writer, and founder of West Africa Weekly. Known for his fearless reporting and deep investigative work, David has uncovered major stories on governance, corruption, and foreign influence in Africa. His work has been featured in prominent outlets, and he remains one of the most influential voices on African geopolitics and media integrity. Before we dive in, we want to acknowledge an unfortunate technical issue. During the recording of this interview, our audio was not captured. As a result, you won't hear our questions or comments. However, because David's responses were so compelling, insightful, and important, we felt it necessary to share them with you as they are. We deeply regret this issue because this was an incredibly fruitful conversation, and we know it would have been more engaging with the full back and forth. We appreciate your patience and understanding, and we are committed to having David back on very soon to continue this discussion the right way. In today's interview, David takes a deep dive into USAID's role, an issue that has sparked growing debate. USAID, the United States Agency for International Development, presents itself as a force for good, funding projects in health, education, governance, and economic development. But beneath the surface, many have raised concerns about whether its influence is truly in Africa's best interest, or if it serves a broader geopolitical agenda. David has been investigating the hidden dynamics of foreign aid, particularly how USAID operates in Africa, who benefits, who loses, and what impact it has on governance, media, and economic independence. His latest findings suggest that foreign aid isn't always what it seems, and that Africans need to take a closer look at the strings attached. Despite the technical issues, we hope you find this conversation as eye opening as we did. Thank you for your support and patience, and we look forward to bringing you more discussions like this in the future. Now let's get into it.
Well, so I guess the reason why it has received quite a bit of coverage in this part of the world is that there are a number of government programs, and in fact, entire sectors of governance in some parts of the continent that are basically held up by USAID funding. So, for example, in Nigeria, where I come from, the entire national HIV treatment infrastructure is basically held up by the PEPFAR program, which is basically USAID funded. So there was a lot of noise about the possibility that when USAID funding is totally gutted and nixed, that basically people are going to start dying of AIDS and whatnot. So that's the narrative that has been promoted quite heavily. However, I'm someone who is very intimately acquainted with the NGO industrial complex, as I refer to it, which can be observed in several African cities. You can see it in Abuja, in Accra, in Nairobi, Cape Town, Dar es Salaam. You can see it in all these places where there exists a class of people, a class of African elites that are affiliated, that are economically affiliated with these donor organizations, which like USAID or organizations that receive funding from USAID directly or indirectly. And I think it's interesting to bring in a data point that I saw recently, which said that about a recent study found that about 17% of all aid actually reaches the intended recipients. So basically 83% of aid actually disappears into a black hole. So that could be administrative costs, that could be inflated contracts, that could be just bare thefts, that could be money laundering, that could be any number of things that we don't even know. So clearly some people's, what's the word I'm looking for? some people's pork barrel has been disrupted by this decision to end USAID, which is where all of the noise, particularly on the African continent, is really coming from, and which is part of the reason why I specifically have been very, very much in support of this push to end USAID. In addition to the fact of the money not getting to its intended target and it just being essentially used to enrich a tiny group of people who become like this like pseudo elite, which is already bad enough in itself. I can point to several other really damaging and terrible things that USAID funding does or potentially has done in our part of the world. So first is that where you have these vast amounts of money flooding into the country unaccountably. So how it works is you can bring, let's say, let me pull a figure out of the air. Let me say $20 million, right? Bring that into this country. You claim that it's aid, right? No one actually asks you any questions, right? You're not paying tax on it because you're a non-profit. You will produce a report at the end of your reporting period claiming that this is what you did with it, even though you didn't do it. You and I know you didn't do it, but you produce a report saying that you did. So where did that money actually go? Nobody knows. And this is happening on a scale that is multiplied by maybe 50 times of the amount that I just mentioned every year. So where is all this money going? You cannot see the evidence of this money anywhere in the economy. It's not as if like you're seeing like this, incredible luxury economy, coming out of nowhere. They can say, okay, this money is being laundered here. No, you're just not seeing it. However, what you are seeing is that every 5 minutes, bear in mind, this is supposedly the continent with the world's poorest people, right? Every 5 minutes in these like distressed economies, these weak, anemic economies, every 5 minutes there's a new non-state actor popping up out of the woodwork. There's a new terror group. There's a new rebel group. There's a new armed non-state actor. There's always something. So it's M23 in DRC, it's Boko Haram in Nigeria, it's AQIM in the Sahel, it's Lakurawas in Chad. There's always, and these guys, they're holding machine guns worth thousands of dollars. They're holding ammo belts worth hundreds of dollars. Some of them have drones, military drones. And if you know what goes into maintaining such infrastructure, right? Military drones they're not equipment that you run with like GSM mobile networks. You need, global positioning systems, satellite communication, all of that. Who is funding this? So when you put two and two together, where you have these really weak economies, where there's basically no real money coming in, like legitimately, right? And any money that is coming in is going out almost immediately as debt repayments, right? Because these are all heavily indebted economies. And then you're seeing these non-state actors just swimming in money and equipment that nobody knows where they came from. And there are always new groups coming out. This year, there have been new groups on the continent. This year, we're only in the second month of the year. New groups have emerged already. So where are they coming from? Who is funding them? So that's why I said the activities of organizations or institutions linked to USAID, which, as you know, itself is an extension of US foreign policy. These need to be looked into, because if I'm sure I don't need to explain to you how the American empire works, how basically there is this technique of going around the world destabilizing weaker countries to the end purpose of basically ensuring that the existing economic and social and political order remains exactly where it is. These countries cannot rise. So these countries cannot move up the value chain. Their economic role in the global economy cannot improve. So basically, these countries are maintained in poverty where they are. Right? This is a well-known tactic. And if you have USAID, which is known to be a very integral part of the American deep state that carries out these things, it's part of that foreign policy establishment. And obviously, it's like the piggy bank of the foreign policy establishment in the US, because, as you know, it's not subject to congressional oversight, and it's also not subject to presidential permission, like the CIA is. So it's basically a law unto itself, almost. So when you put two and two together, you basically have this completely unaccountable, out of control, rogue foreign policy institution which is funded to the tune of about $50 billion a year, that is active in your relatively weak country, doing whatever the hell it wants, throwing money around wherever the hell it wants to, and then coincidentally, you're seeing armed non-state actors springing up and destabilizing your country, right? So can you not put two and two together? So that's another reason why I believe that the gutting of USAID is very good news for Africa. The third reason, which is probably not as dramatic as the other two, but is no less important, is that the existence of this so-called NGO economy is actually distorting economies across Africa. It's distorting development trajectories. It's distorting real estate markets. It's distorting a lot of things. And I'll explain what I mean by that. Now, let me use Uganda as an example, right? This is a country where its per capita income is less than $1,000, right? Objectively, these are very poor people, right? Now, Kampala, which is the capital of Uganda, has condos and apartments, right? I didn't say houses and mansions. I said condos and apartments where the price tags, first of all, are in US dollars, and the prices are like $300,000 and upward. And I'm thinking to myself, how does a country whose per capita income is about $890 a year have a real estate market where you regularly and commonly see apartments going for $300,000? Who are these things for? Because it definitely is not for Ugandans, is it? And this situation I've just described, you can see it in Lagos, you can see it in Abuja, you can see it in Accra, Nairobi. You can see it all over the continent, where whichever city you land in Africa, you see a lot of construction going on. To your eyes, it would look as if this continent is having an economic boom. There's so much construction going on. There's so much new shiny stuff. It looks like, wow, Africa is going places. It's not. Because what is actually happening is that there is a very tiny segment of the economy that is being catered to by the rest of the economy. There's a very tiny segment of the population, rather, that is being catered to by the entire economy. So this sort of NGO economy that has been created, and that pseudo elites that I referenced, these people, obviously, they don't really have any connection to the local economy. They don't get paid from the local economy. They don't make their money from there. They don't rely on local infrastructure. Their entire lives are just helicoptered in from the US, basically, and the UK or the EU or wherever. So basically, you have the economy the local economy then distorting itself to try to get a piece of that action at the expense of everybody else. Because bear in mind, this is maybe 1% of the population. So the other 99%, everything, the inflation is crazy for such a poor place. So like in Lagos, now Lagos is a city that I grew up in. This is a city where what is considered to be a decent monthly wage will be maybe 100,000 naira, which in dollar terms that would be about $70. That's considered to be a livable monthly wage in Lagos, right? Now it's almost impossible to find an apartment, a one-bedroom apartment, like a studio apartment, right, in Lagos for less than 1 million naira per annum, and rents in Lagos are paid per annum; they're not paid monthly. So basically, with what is considered to be a livable monthly income in Lagos, you cannot rent a studio apartment. You cannot. So basically, the economic fundamentals of the country that you're in are completely divorced from what is happening in the real estate market, and not just the real estate market, even other markets like food. Everything is being distorted because there's this foreign money being helicoptered in to a small segment of the population, and then the rest of the economy is being distorted to cater to that small segment at everyone else's expense, which is a terrible thing. That is what ensures that there's this sort of de facto economic apartheid in place, because also bear in mind that the deeper layer to this is that out of that 1% that I referenced, maybe more than half of that 1% are white people, the expatriates. So this also turns into a form of like racialized economic apartheid as well. So this isn't South Africa we're talking about. This is the rest of the continent where we have really never had such issues. But we're starting to have those issues now. There are parts of Abuja, there are parts of Accra, there are parts of Nairobi where you go there as a black person and you almost look out of place on your own continent because everyone that is there does not look like you, right? That cannot be a good thing. In terms of GDP, it's not really contributing that much, to be fair. It's not like, however, for such a small part of the economy, it has this incredible ability to skew consumer prices, for example. So in terms of its actual contribution to the economy, I'm not sure it's in the Nigerian GDP calculation. I'm not entirely sure if the non-profit sector is even captured. But even if it is, it's not. I don't think it's up to. It's definitely not up to like 5%. It's not. It's not a major contributor. 5% is overstating it. It'd probably be maybe 2 or 3%. It's not a whole lot. But for such a then again, that is for Nigeria, right? It actually varies across the continent. Now, if you're in a country like Kenya, it will be significantly higher there. The reason being, obviously, that Kenya is basically the NGO HQ of Africa, basically. So everybody's there. Like apparently, Bill Gates spends more of his time in Nairobi than anywhere else on the planet. So Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, that's basically the operational HQ. The UN base for Africa, it's in Nairobi. All the major non-profit organizations, they're based in Nairobi. So it's a much bigger part of the economy in Kenya than in somewhere like Nigeria or Ghana. However, even in places where it's a smaller part of the economy by GDP share, it still exerts such this power to skew things and make things unaffordable for the locals, where it almost seems as if as a child growing up in these countries now, your ambition isn't to be a doctor or to be a lawyer, to be a pilot, but your ambition is to go, work for an NGO and prepare PowerPoint slides, right? And at the end of the month, you get paid, maybe someone's paying you $6,000 every month, which is many, 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 many times more than, than what the, locals earn. And that just completely skews everything. Yeah. Even investment decisions are affected by this. If you have a plot of land and you've got some money, you want to develop something on that plot of land. Maybe you could invest in a factory producing something, and you're thinking, okay, how long does it take to break even? When you look at the numbers, then you think, you know what, why don't I do an event center or a hotel? Because if I do that, then there's always going to be an NGO that's always renting it out for some seminar or training program or the other. And that's how I make my money back. So you have places now in urban Africa where you're like, where are all the people who spend money in these places? Why are there so many hotels in like a mid-sized city? Why are there so many event centers? Like who is all of this for? Like we don't have a tourism economy or anything. So who is all this for? It's all of this is being built to chase the NGO sector because they know that this is what the NGO sector does. The primary activity that the NGO sector carries out in Africa is those events, right? Those seminars and webinars and what they call skills acquisition and training. And it's basically sitting down in a room with, where you're being catered to, right? And depending on the budget you have, the location and the beauty of the room varies, right? So it could be a Four Seasons hotel, could be a Kempinski hotel, could be a Hilton, could be basically that. And that's the whole racket, basically. And it's happening in this city this week, it's happening in another city next week. And so everybody is basically making money from this whole giant ball of nothing because no actual work, no actual productive addition to the economy is being made except consumption. Yeah, multiple actually. So the HQ of what I refer to as the NGO industrial complex in Nigeria is the capital, it's Abuja. You will find any number of these so-called youth training, youth development, skill acquisition, women empowerment. There's an endless amount of these word soup terms that they have, and it's basically the same thing. gather a bunch of poor people in a room, make promises to them, make them sign a piece of paper or something, and nothing really ever comes of it. Maybe if they're lucky, maybe they might get a sewing machine here and there. But beyond that, nothing really comes out of it for the people. But I guess the people who get something out of it are the people who organize it, because they then get to take pictures and they get to put those pictures in their glossy reports, which are then sent back to the donor as proof that work was done. And then another tranche of funds hit, and the scam is repeated again. And obviously, this is in the context of Nigeria, that's the country it's the world's poverty capital. It has more people living in extreme poverty than anywhere else, including India. So there's an inexhaustible supply of poor people who you gather in a room. So yeah, everyone takes a cut, and then even the money that makes it to the program is not the money that makes it to the actual people. So it's very common that at the end of all the cuts that everyone takes, there's actually nothing left for the actual recipients. But I guess the number one, from my years of interacting with the aid industry in Nigeria, because I've worked in and around that space myself. So by some context, between 2017 and 2018, I was working in television at the time, but the show I was working on was sponsored by the Open Society Institute for West Africa, which is part of the Open Society Foundation's, George Soros thing. So I got to see sort of up close what it meant. There are a couple of things I don't want to mention because I'll be implicating people, but basically the talent that people in that sector have in this part of the world is the ability to generate paperwork that doesn't exist, right? So if you need to show a receipt saying that so and so was spent on this, that receipt doesn't exist because so and so wasn't spent on it. That receipt will show up somehow. You create one, right? And it's very convincing. And to be honest, the donors are not really interested in how authentic it is, to be honest. The donors just want plausible deniability, right? Everybody just wants to cover their ass. And these guys are the kings and high priests of ass covering. So every type of covering that needs to be generated, they know how to do it. Like I've seen things you wouldn't believe. Okay, let me say one thing that I've seen, which I don't think it's necessarily gonna criminalize anybody. So you're working on a TV show, right? There's 4 writers, there's 2 head writers, and then there's 1 producer. So there's altogether that's 7 people on the creative team, right? Now, what was in the budget that was approved by the funder is that there's 5 writers, there's 3 head writers, and there's 2 producers. So as against the 7 who are actually on the team, there's supposed to be 9. Or is it? Yeah, like 5 plus 3 plus 8 plus, no, they're supposed to be 10, right? So the funder is paying for 10, you are paying for 7. The extra difference of 3, nobody knows what's happening to it, but the funder paid for it. So that's one thing. Or this one I found particularly egregious, right? What's in the budget is, so the show I worked on, it was like, there's an episode every week, right? So it's 4 episodes a month. So what was in the approved budget is that every writer gets paid $1,000 per episode, because I was a writer, right? Now, what the recipient of the funding does is that they give you a contract as a writer saying that you get paid $1,000 per month, not per episode, per month. So basically 3/4 of the money that was meant to be paid to the writers, again, disappeared into a black hole. Nobody knows where it went. I'll tell you something else that is done. The budget from the funder is written in dollars, US dollars, right? So it's $1,000 per episode. Now, they don't even come and tell you it's $1,000 a month. They convert the $1,000 to the local currency equivalent, right? And then give you a contract written in a local currency equivalent, knowing fully well that there's an arbitrage difference that someone is going to profit from. There's a spread. And again, that spread disappears into a black hole. So there's multiple people and multiple layers of people who are each eating off the show in multiple different ways. And the funder will pretend that they don't know, because at the end of everything, there's going to be paperwork, there's going to be pay slips for 10 employees where there's 7. There's going to be tax payments, income tax payment slips for 10 employees where there were only 7. There's going to be receipts showing that payments to US dollar accounts were made when payments were made to Naira accounts. Every kind of paperwork you're looking for, it's there. So that's basically how this system, it's one big scam. Well, so, I mean, I don't know how familiar you are with the work of whistleblowers from that sector. So people like Mike Benz, who have been very vocal in the past few years and months, where typically how it works, and this is not just in Nigeria or in Africa, this is something that's done across the global south. USAID is essentially used as a slush fund to buy off elites and to build influence, under the table influence in those countries. Because when I think when people hear that USAID is used to buy influence, it almost sounds like a victimless crime. It sounds like, oh, it's lobbying. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the US government having executive control and influence in a foreign country that it constitutionally should not have under that country's laws. I'll give you an example of this. So currently in Nigeria right now, there's a whole conversation surrounding GMOs, because the usual suspects are trying to sort of stampede Nigeria into like blanket approval for GMO seeds and GMO animals and whatnot, right? So there's a political conversation about that going on in Nigeria right now. Now, one of the facets of this political conversation is the fact that if GMOs are to be approved in Nigeria, then there would need to be a constitutional amendment. Because currently under Nigeria's present constitution, it's kind of like it's a gray area, right? So a few weeks ago, there was a Senate hearing, right, on potential constitutional amendment, and there were 4. So it's basically a committee, right, and there were 4 organizations that were present at this hearing, right? None of these organizations was an organization representing the Nigerian government or the Nigerian people. Each of these organizations was an NGO, and they were all funded by the same basket of funders. So I think there were 4 of them. 2 of them were funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, ultimately. One of them was funded by the State Department, and one of them is funded by USAID. Right, so it's basically this, and they all sort of work hand in glove, right? And so basically what you have is a hearing about potentially amending a sovereign country's constitution to allow potentially, let me not say potentially dangerous, right? Let me say controversial products from another country, which by the way are banned almost everywhere, allowing those products into this country, right, via a constitutional amendment. And the parties that are present to give their submissions are all parties that are working for the foreign policy establishment of the country that is trying to push those products on this sovereign country. Why does the US government have that capacity in Nigeria? Why does it have that power? Like by the way, this wasn't in the news, this wasn't reported. Most people didn't even know that there was a public hearing for a potential constitutional amendment. But the only reason I know this is because I'm close to the space and I talk to people in the space, right? Because it's my job to have my ear to the ground. If I wasn't a journalist, I probably wouldn't know either, right? But the US government knows. So basically, you have a situation where the US government, through USAID and these other sort of deep state actors, knows more about what is happening in my country than I do, and has more access to the decision makers in my country than I do, and has more influence on the decision making processes in my country than I do. Actually, I don't. I actually don't. And the reason is very simple. The reason is that already the vast majority of this supposed help never made it to the people who needed it anyway. The vast majority of those people have been left to fend for themselves anyway. So for them, it's going to be a case of tomorrow is just like today, and today is just like yesterday. Nothing will have functionally changed for them. Now, the people for whom something will functionally change is that NGO elite, that pseudo elite that I referenced. they are going to be in a whole world of trouble, right? Because overnight, and that we're already starting to see that, right? Especially in the U.S., but if increasingly we're going to see that happen in Africa. The effects haven't become so apparent yet because a lot of the funding that is still keeping things going was already approved before Donald Trump took office. So I think it's from maybe the end of the year, this year, or toward the end of this year, that's when the effects are going to really start cascading across Africa and the global south, where overnight, some of these people in these pseudo elites, NGO funded spaces are going to realize that they don't just not have a job anymore. They don't have a career anymore because what the Trump administration is doing is not merely gutting USAID. They're gutting the entire um, bone and structure of this sort of foreign influence peddling monster. So not just the ability to fund itself via USAID, but also the ability to even use the levers of law and policy to advance itself. So they are using their own levers, their own executive and legislative levers to try to comprehensively cut down the powers of this hydra-headed beast, right? And the reason they're doing that is not because they're trying to help us, obviously. They're doing it because they feel like that is the same beast that targeted them in 2020, and they're probably not wrong about that. So to them, it's self-preservation, but it just so happens that that's also very good news for Africa. So what is going to happen is that entire fields of these like pseudo careers that have been created that didn't exist 10 years ago, like someone will wake up and start calling themselves disinformation researcher, disinformation expert, whatever the hell that means, uh, hybrid warfare hybrid warfare expert, soft power consultant, fact checker. These things that either didn't exist or meant something else entirely just 10 years ago, which have been souped up into these pseudo job titles that they are now. A lot of them are going to completely disappear, right? And a lot of well-paid people are going to wake up one morning and they're going to be high, dry, and broke, which is also a good thing because I think one of the things that will do is that this sort of hyperinflating real estate market across urban Africa, somebody needs to put a needle into it. I think this might be the needle where like there's no guaranteed foreign dollar inflow every year from this NGO space. Then I think there'll be a correction in these markets and things will start to be priced a lot more realistically, priced in such a way that it actually has some relevance to the economic fundamentals of the country that it's servicing. So looking forward to it. Yeah, I agree. I agree. If you're gonna make an omelet, some eggs will definitely have to be broken. Ultimately, the goal in trying to build a modern African economy is not to build an economy of drivers and cooks. Right. The goal is to build an economy, an industrialized economy of people who actually earn real money, who can actually do real long-term planning with it. The goal is so these are short-term considerations, right? And it's that argument is very similar to the argument I heard in Nigeria all the time that, well, who's going to pay for HIV treatment for those who have the HIV virus? So are you going to abandon them to die of AIDS because of geopolitics? And it's a very emotionally potent argument, but it's also a very sort of short term kind of argument. So if you leave the status quo as it is, have you really helped them in the long run? Right? Because the goal in the long run is for the person who is a driver or a cook or shop attendant or whatever to have social mobility to move up. Currently, where they are, they have zero social mobility. They're a driver now, they're a cook now, they're going to be a driver in a cook 30 years' time. They're not going anywhere. Surely that can be the goal. So even though I admit that yes, it does sound a bit, it sounds a bit harsh, and it's not a transition that will be easy to make, but it's a transition that has to happen. This sort of NGOization of a country's economy is never a good thing. So I guess what will also help is in addition to being told that this is good in the long run, people also need to know that this NGO funding, this American funding, right, wasn't just funding, humanitarian causes and whatnot. It was funding direct, deliberate policy decisions that made you poor. It was deliberately doing that. So, for example, I mean, you're in Kenya right now, so you witnessed the whole craziness of last year. And what led to it was a finance bill that was basically dictated word for word by the IMF, which is a US government extension, right? There's actually a document, there's an IMF report. The document is flying around the internet where this was in January last year. It actually stated that recommendations would lead to civil unrest. Significant civil unrest was the exact phrase. And the recommendation was, regardless of whether there's civil unrest or not, implement these recommendations, just power through it. So essentially, these things that we're recommending to you, they mean that, people are going to fucking die. But it doesn't matter, just do it anyway, because we said so, right? And that's in an official document. And this is a policy recommendation from a US government extension. So this charitable, what's the word I'm looking for? This philanthropic entity, this is actually what it wants for you. It actually needs you to remain poor. The economic model of the US and the global north depends on Africa being poor, right? Because Africa's poverty means that African resources will continue to be cheap, which is what the global industrial economy relies on, cheap industrial inputs, right? So the funding that these people are crying about, this funding, in addition to, funding the lifestyle of experts who hire you as a driver and a cook, and funding HIV treatment and whatnot, it's also funding policy research institutes that you've never heard of, which write policy for your government and basically inform your government's policy. They write policy for your government. Your government passes that policy into law, and you think it's your legislators and your lawmakers that wrote it. And no, it's some American kid who graduated, who went to Harvard, who wrote the law for you, and is funded by some USAID or Gates-funded NGO to put together this thing. And this thing is basically stating that instead of pursuing industrial policy to become industrialized and to grow your economy, what you need to do is, in the case of Kenya, double down on tourism, triple down on tourism. Your whole life should be about receiving rich white visitors from abroad, right? In the case of Nigeria, double down on extracting crude oil and natural gas and selling raw, unprocessed crude oil and natural gas to Europe. In the case of DRC, implement reforms that make it easier to extract coltan and tantalite and cobalt and copper and whatever. These are the recommendations that are being pushed into your government. And that is the reason why you remain poor. That is the reason why your government doesn't have industrial policy. It is because there are these very well-funded NGO extensions that you have never heard of. They work in silence, but they have more access to your government than you do. And they are the ones pushing these things through and ensuring that you remain poor. So if you defund the entire monster, you're also defunding those guys. People need to understand that very clearly, that your poverty as an African is not accidental. It didn't just happen. And it's not because God decided that you are meant to be poor. It's not because Africa is like poor by geography or something. There's no economic or geopolitical reason why Africa necessarily should be poor. Right? If you think about it economically, what is the antidote to poverty, right? It's trade. Well, it's a continent with over 1 billion people, and it's a continent that is very closely located to the other two most densely populated continents in the world, Europe and Asia, right? It's a continent that has every natural resource you can think of. It has, great water resources, it has arable land, it has lots of people, including, educated people. So there is actually no reason why it should just be as poor as it is. So that poverty is a result of deliberate and ongoing policy decisions that you don't even know about and that are being funded by these sort of unaccountable, dark funds that are supposedly donor money. So to fund the entire thing, slay the entire monster and take that short-term pain for your own benefits in the long run. Yeah, it's like you're listening to a conversation I had. Funny enough, with someone in Kenya just yesterday. That's exactly what I told him. I told him I actually think there's more potential, there's more revolutionary potential in West Africa than in East Africa, and the reason simply being, you guys are just way too comfortable. So it actually did start off as a completely organic protest movement. It actually did start off that way. However, you're not wrong in saying that it took on a very Black Lives Matter-ish type of character. And the reason is these sort of deep state foreign policy apparatchiks, right? These NGO extensions are always very quick to monitor and jump on things for the purpose of subverting them, right? Because in these parts of the world, the priority of the US empire is to maintain status quo. Because basically, as far as the US is concerned, we're exactly where they want us to be. We're poor, we're disorganized, where our economies are, you know, inflation is going through the roof, our exchange rates are just constantly cratering. It's a very profitable situation for them. Because when you're in that situation and you take an IMF loan and then they get to tell you, hey, you have to devalue your currency, which makes your resources cheaper for them in dollar terms. And then you have to, ramp up your exports, so you're basically running ever faster on a treadmill and you're going nowhere. That's exactly where they want you to be. So in that situation, what they don't want is any sort of revolutionary political movement. So one of their goals with their Africa policy, particularly their West Africa policy, is to monitor very closely whoever and whatever has some sort of revolutionary coloration online and then subvert it. So subversion is primarily by infiltration and then misdirection. So it started off as just a group of unknown young people who had just had enough, and the whole thing just exploded and it took everybody by surprise, including me, right? Because I did not see it coming. It took everybody by surprise. And then, literally, maybe less than a week into it, some people, some of the usual civil society actors, right, NGO actors, they had a light bulb moment above their heads. And then it became like kind of like what you saw in Kenya last year, where it became a competition for who can take a better iconic photo, and who it became a huge attention whoring sort of thing. And then people started fighting for credit when everyone was still on the streets. And then people started fighting for who's going to be in charge of doing what. And some people wanted to turn it into some sort of mega concert. There was talk about renting big screens to watch to watch football at the weekends. People were supplying like jollof rice to protesters who were blocking the streets, right? And water. People were hooking up. People were buying weed at the protests, and it became a huge party. And all of this was scripted, right? All of this was done intentionally. This is how protests are subverted, right? This is how protests. This is how revolutions are thwarted. This is how revolutionary movements are subverted. So yes, this is not USAID directly per se. There might have been USAID funded elements who were involved, but I would say this is more of the character of the US foreign policy establishment with regards to how it interacts with this part of the world. It knows which characters to inject to achieve what purpose. So every time, for example, every time there's any type of protest in Nigeria, you'll always notice that there's always one or two people who somehow, even though this has absolutely nothing to do with them, they might not even be in the country at the time, all of a sudden, you just find them somewhere at the front trying to make it about them. So like in the NSARS era, it was the protest was called NSARS, right? And then one of these characters came, and all of a sudden, because he has this thing that he calls it Revolution Now. It's like his personal platform. Next thing, he starts trying to brand it as Revolution Now. He starts trying to like take credit for NSARS and make it about him. And things almost turned violent because of how angry people were. But the point is, if people hadn't been that angry, he would have been successful. And then it would have become a him thing. And then a lot of the critical mass that was gathered wouldn't have been gathered because people would have been like, you know, I don't really want him. This guy has run for president before. Like, we know who he is. This guy is an attention seeker. Like, let's just not. Right. So they know. Same thing was also done where there's someone else whose name I'm not going to mention. She's not worth mentioning. But she somehow always manages to be at any kind of protest venue with someone who has a very high quality digital camera focused on her somehow, right? That's her thing. And she goes and yeah, she knows how to take like these sort of iconic photographs and make herself the sort of de facto face of these things, right? So people are literally getting beaten up by police. Somebody got concussed. Somebody's skull got injured. Like there's real violence going on, and this person comes in when everyone has taken the tear gas and everything, and then goes and does like what's this guy Colin Kaepernick, right? She goes and takes a knee and does like a Black Power salute or something. I don't understand. It's like just basically like took what they consider to be a mix of every iconic photo that has ever been taken. So it's like the Jesse Owens plus the Colin Kaepernick all smushed into one, and does that. And someone happened to be there to take a very, very well framed, color graded picture of this thing. And next thing you know, this picture is flying everywhere, and then this person has become some sort of a hero because she took a picture, right? And that's how. And obviously, I don't need to tell you this is a civil society actor, right? So this is how these people are injected into these things to turn them into clown shows and ultimately to derail them and make them fail, which is exactly what happened. Okay, so the first book is called The Jungle, A Personal Journey with the Enfant Terrible of Nigerian Journalism, or just The Jungle for short. So you can find it on Amazon. You can also find it, if you're in Kenya, it's available at a bookstore in Nairobi called Noria, Kenya. It's basically Nairobi's best known bookstore. It's right in the city center. If you're in Nigeria, it's available on Roving Heights. Globally, it's available on Amazon. So if you just Google David Hundeyin, The Jungle, or search for it on Amazon, you see it. The second book, which was released in January last year, is called Breaking Points, a journalist's quest for salvation in Nigeria's chaos, or just Breaking Point for short. That's also available in all those places. It's available on Amazon. It's available on Noria, Kenya. It's available on Roving Heights for listeners in Nigeria. And I guess my closing remarks for the benefit of your transatlantic audience, as you described it, would be that, as you said, we're all seeing the same. Where there's a proverb, or there's a folk story that I used to hear as a kid, where there are three blind men who are standing around an elephant, and each of them is touching a different part of the elephant. So the man holding the ear says that the elephant looks like a huge fan. The man holding the trunk says the elephant looks like a huge snake. And the man holding the tusk says the elephant looks like a huge tooth or something. And then they all start fighting over it. Meanwhile, each of them is correct and each of them is also wrong because they're not seeing the bigger picture. So I think that's the issue between Africans in the diaspora and Africans on the continent. We're all seeing different sides of the same monster. And somehow we don't realize that. Just zoom out and you see that we're all actually pretty much in the same position globally, wherever we are. So I'm happy that I live in an age where we're able to have conversations like this and understand each other. And there seems to be a growing understanding of the reality that the destinies of Africans on the continent and outside the continent are inextricably linked. I'm happy I live in an age where people are starting to figure that out. For the longest time, I felt like someone walking around in the wilderness because nobody seemed to get it, both inside the continent and outside. That is changing every day. I guess we have the internet to thank for that. People on the continent especially now have much more access to information than they used to have. Africa used to be under an information monopoly or an information embargo almost. I remember when I was growing up, We had one digital satellite TV provider for the whole continent, and it was European owned. Right, so we only knew whatever white people wanted us to know. That used to be the reality, but the internet has shaken that up now, and I think that's how come we can have this sort of rapport and this sort of understanding now. So I know it's there's this sort of well promoted meme that continental Africans don't like diaspora Africans, or they look down on them or whatnot. And you may have even met people who actually confirm these stereotypes to you, people who act in those ways. You should understand that they are also suffering from the same sickness that is afflicting, many of us. Some of us have been fortunate enough to be able to sort of understand what is happening and fight it. Many of us haven't. So don't hold it against the entirety of, the continental community. If you come across some of us who don't understand how the world works, eventually we will learn. And eventually all of us will come to a greater understanding of who we are and how the world works.